Two choke points are already choking. And now Iran and its allies are reaching for a third. And that third one happens to be the one connecting Asia to Europe. So if you thought this war was contained to the Persian Gulf, this week proved you wrong. Because the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow gap between Yemen and the Horn of Africa, is now under direct confirmed attack. Saudi crude flowing through it has already collapsed by half. And the government that started this entire chain reaction, Washington, is now watching its own founding fathers' 230-year-old warning about foreign entanglements play out in real time. So this morning we're breaking down exactly what's happening at this third choke point right now. The actual shipping numbers behind the panic, Iran's own explicit doctrine tying all three, waterways together in a single threat, and why a foreign policy speech from 1796 is suddenly relevant to a war being fought with drones and cruise missiles. Let's start with the numbers, because they tell the story faster than any rhetoric can. Since Houthi forces began targeting Saudi shipping specifically on July 22nd, average Saudi crude flows through the Bab el-Mandeb have fallen 50%, according to the shipping tracking firm Koppler, cut in half in a matter of days. And that collapse matters enormously because of what this specific route had become over the past several months. Crude oil and condensate transiting the Bab el-Mandeb had actually increased from 3.7 million barrels per day in the first quarter of last year to 5.4 million barrels per day in the first quarter of this year, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, meaning shipping companies had been actively routing more and more crude through this exact strait specifically because the Strait of Hormuz had become too dangerous to rely on. Tankers were loading in Yanbu on the Red Sea instead of entering the Persian Gulf at all, then sailing down through the Bab el-Mandeb toward markets in Asia, including South Korea and China. So this wasn't some minor secondary route. It had become the entire industry's backup plan, the release valve that let Gulf oil keep moving. Even while Hormuz stayed choked, and now that backup plan is itself under direct attack. And here's why that leaves the region with genuinely nowhere left to turn, taking the long way around Africa, through the Cape of Good Hope, back up through the Suez Canal to return to Saudi ports inside the Red Sea. Would normally add around 15 days to the journey, 15 extra days, at massively increased fuel cost, insurance cost, and shipping cost, just to avoid two strategic waterways that both now carry real risk of attack. And CNN's own live reporting on this exact moment described the underlying mechanics plainly. An Iran-backed militia has explicitly warned it would target any Saudi shipping attempting to transit the Bab el-Mandeb choke point, and that threat is already changing real-world shipping patterns. Vessel tracking data reviewed by CNN this week showed ships leaving the Gulf of Aden near the coast of Oman and specifically avoiding the direct route, instead heading down the coast of East Africa entirely, with several showing South African ports as their destination, and at least one showing Gibraltar as its next stop. And every one of those specific vessels was shown as sailing in ballast, meaning empty, not carrying oil at all, so you're watching real, physical, confirmed rerouting happening on the water right now, not analyst speculation about what might happen if tensions escalate further. Now let's talk about why this specific strait carries so much global weight in the first place, because the numbers on its overall importance are staggering even before you factor in this current crisis. The Bab el-Mandeb handles roughly 12% of global seaborne oil trade, according to figures reported by Fox News, and separately, Britannica's own reference entry describes it as the third busiest choke point in the entire world for oil trade, ranking behind only the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Hormuz itself. And beyond oil specifically, it also carries about 1/4 of all global container trade, everything from consumer electronics to clothing to industrial parts moving between Asia and Europe passes through this exact and gap in the map. So when you hear the phrase third choke point, that's not just dramatic framing. It's a literal documented ranking. This is genuinely the third most important oil choke point on the planet, and it's now sitting alongside the first, the Strait of Hormuz, both simultaneously under threat at the exact same time, for what analysts are calling the first time this has ever happened, at what one detailed risk assessment specifically described as an operational rather than rhetorical level, meaning this isn't just threats and posturing anymore. Actual strikes, actual vessel targeting, and actual measurable traffic collapse are happening at both waterways concurrently. And that same assessment laid out exactly why this combination is so dangerous for the global economy specifically. Hormuz disruption drives Saudi exports toward Red Sea routing as an alternative, and then a coordinated Bab el-Mandeb threat places that exact alternative routing at risk too. And the result, in the assessment's own blunt phrasing, is that no viable maritime export corridor remains fully secure for Gulf crude. Read that back. No viable export corridor. Full stop. That's the actual state of Gulf oil logistics as of this week. Not a worst-case scenario being modeled, the documented current reality. Now, let's talk about Iran's own explicit framing of this strategy, Because Tehran hasn't been subtle about connecting these dots itself, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a statement carried directly by Iran's own IRNA state news agency, warning it could target what it called all other export corridors that benefit the U.S. and its allies, specifically in response to the United States reinstating its naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. And the exact phrase the IRGC used is worth repeating precisely, because it lays out the entire doctrine in one sentence. Quote, regional energy exports are either shared by all or denied to all. End quote. That's not a threat aimed at one specific waterway. That's a declared comprehensive doctrine, treating every export route in the region as a single interconnected system that Iran claims the right to shut down entirely if it doesn't get access to it too. And separately, Iran's advisor to the supreme leader, Ali Akbar Velayati, made the same connection explicit even earlier in this conflict, warning that the resistance front, meaning Iran and its aligned proxy forces, could target the Bab el-Mandeb specifically, and that the flow of global energy and trade, in his own words, can be disrupted with a single signal. A single signal. That's the specific language a senior Iranian official used to describe how quickly this third choke point could be shut down if Tehran decided to give the order. Now here's an important piece of nuance that I think actually makes this story more credible rather than less, because it comes from a defense analyst pushing back directly on the idea that Iran itself has any real military capability to close this specific strait. A researcher named Goltz told reporting on this exact question that, quote, Iran has no military forces near the Bab el-Mandeb, end quote, meaning any actual disruption there has to come through. Iran asserting influence via regional proxies rather than direct Iranian military action. And that distinction matters enormously because it tells you the entire threat to this third choke point runs specifically through Yemen's Houthi movement, an Iran-aligned group that has been separately, independently threatening Saudi shipping through this exact strait since 2015, well before this current war with the United States even began. So what's actually happening isn't Iran developing some new offensive capability at a third location. It's Iran leveraging an existing proxy relationship, one that already has documented history disrupting this exact waterway, and activating it specifically as leverage in the broader standoff over Hormuz. And that's precisely why analysts describe the current moment as structurally different from every prior tension cycle at these choke points, because the absence of a functioning U.S.-Iran ceasefire removes what had previously been the primary mechanism for actually de-escalating these threats before they turned into real disruption. Now let's bring in the actual scale of what's happened over just the past week, because this isn't a slow-building story. It accelerated fast. Yemen's Iran-aligned Houthi rebels claimed strikes on 2 separate Saudi oil tankers and separately hit Saudi Aramco's own facilities directly at Jizan and at Yanbu specifically, the exact terminal that had become Saudi Arabia's primary workaround for the entire Hormuz crisis, using what the Houthis themselves described as dozens of ballistic and cruise missiles along with drones. And Saudi Arabia's own state press agency confirmed at least one of those tanker strikes directly, and separately maritime intelligence firms documented real, immediate consequences. Multiple tankers carrying millions of barrels of crude, gas oil, and naphtha actually turned around before even reaching the strait, rather than risk transiting it at all. And Lloyd's List Intelligence, a maritime analysis firm, described the overall situation as, in their own words, a double whammy, on top of the disruption already happening at Hormuz, and said directly that the Houthi threats specifically raised questions on the viability of this entire route. And this week brought yet another escalation on top of all of that. Another vessel has reported being struck in the Strait of Hormuz itself, according to the organization that monitors marine traffic in the region. So even as attention shifts toward this third choke point at Bab el-Mandeb, the original flashpoint at Hormuz hasn't calmed down at all. It's continuing to produce fresh incidents in real time, alongside everything happening further south. Now, here's where this story genuinely connects to something written 230 years ago, because the situation the United States finds itself in right now, deeply entangled in a distant regional conflict, with multiple foreign governments each pulling American policy in different directions, oil markets reacting to every development, and Washington, D.C. forced to respond to threats. Emerging from proxy forces it doesn't directly control is precisely the scenario George Washington devoted the most attention to in his farewell address, published on September 19, 1796, in Philadelphia's American Daily Advertiser, announcing he would not seek a third term, and I want to give you his actual words, not a paraphrase, because the specific phrasing genuinely still lands today. Washington wrote, quote, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world," end quote. And he continued, warning that the United States should avoid what he called, quote, "inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others, end quote, because, in his own memorable phrase, quote, the nation which indulges toward another in habitual hatred or in habitual fondness is in some degree a slave, end quote. Now I want to be precise about what that address actually argued, because it's frequently misquoted. Washington did not call for total isolation from the world. He specifically said the United States should, quote, observe good faith and justice towards all nations, end quote, and should pursue harmony and liberal commercial relations. Broadly, what he specifically warned against was permanent binding political alliances, entanglements that would drag the United States into conflicts that were fundamentally not its own, driven by other nations' rivalries rather than genuine American interests. And he was explicit about why that mattered so much for a young, still fragile republic. He warned that foreign nations could not be trusted to do anything more than pursue their own interests when entering into agreements with the United States, and that expecting what he called real favors from nation to nation was fundamentally unrealistic. Now look at the current situation through that exact lens. The United States is currently managing simultaneous, tangled relationships with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, all three of which reportedly pressured Trump directly to call off a major planned strike on Iran just last weekend, with Oman functioning as the primary diplomatic back channel to Tehran itself, while separately trying to check Iran's own ambitions in the region, while simultaneously trying to protect Israel's security interests, while simultaneously being asked to defend international shipping lanes that a huge share of the rest of the world, particularly Asian economies, depend on just as much as America does. That is precisely the web of permanent, cross-cutting foreign entanglements Washington specifically warned against. The United States isn't fighting a war purely in defense of its own direct national interest at this point. It's managing an entire constellation of allied and partner relationships, each with its own separate agenda, each capable of pulling American policy in a different direction depending on which government calls the White House that particular week. And the third choke point story specifically illustrates exactly why that kind of entanglement becomes so dangerous, because a threat that started as a narrow bilateral dispute between the United States and Iran over the Strait of Hormuz has now genuinely spread through Iran's proxy relationship with the Houthis into a completely separate waterway, primarily threatening Saudi Arabian exports specifically, dragging Saudi Arabia's own economic security directly into what began as an American-Iranian confrontation, and pulling in still more countries in the process. Egypt, for instance, confirmed a drone struck 2 natural gas vessels at one of its own ports this week, a country that hadn't been a direct combatant in this conflict at all until that specific incident. So the entanglement Washington warned about in 1796 isn't a historical curiosity here. It's the literal mechanism by which this war keeps expanding. One alliance, one partner relationship, one proxy network at a time, each pulling in another government, another economy, another set of civilians who had no direct stake in the original dispute over who controls transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, I do want to give you the fuller, more complicated picture of how Washington's own address has actually been interpreted and used across American history, because it's not a simple one-directional lesson. Historians teaching this exact document have specifically pushed back against reading it purely as a blueprint for isolationism, noting that Washington's advice against joining a permanent alliance was heeded for more than a century and a half, but that heeding it didn't mean the United States avoided foreign involvement entirely. It meant American leaders, for generations, specifically avoided binding permanent political alliances while still engaging commercially and diplomatically with the wider world. And that's actually a meaningful distinction worth applying to the current moment too. The question this third choke point crisis is really raising isn't whether the United States should be involved in the Middle East at all. That ship, so to speak, sailed a very long time ago. The question is whether the current web of entanglements, active combat obligations tied to Israel's security, active combat obligations tied to defending Gulf shipping lanes, active diplomatic obligations to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, and now an expanding set of secondary obligations spreading to Egypt and potentially further, has crossed the specific line Washington was actually warning about: permanent entanglement in disputes that are fundamentally not America's own, driven by the rivalries and interests of other nations rather than direct American security needs. Now let's bring this all the way back to where things actually stand this morning, because that's ultimately the most important thing to understand. 2 of the world's most critical oil choke points, Hormuz and el-Mandeb, the first and third busiest in the entire world, are simultaneously disrupted for the first time in documented history, at an actual operational level rather than just rhetorical threats. Saudi. Crude flows through the Bab el-Mandeb have already collapsed by half in a matter of days. Real tankers are already turning around mid-voyage rather than risk transiting either strait. Iran's own Revolutionary Guard has publicly declared a doctrine treating every regional export corridor as a single interconnected target, sharing them with everyone or denying them to everyone. And the crisis has already begun spreading beyond the original combatants, pulling in Egypt this week, and pulling deeper and deeper into questions of exactly how entangled Saudi Arabia's own economic security has become with America's broader Iran strategy. And sitting underneath all of that is a 230-year-old warning from the country's very first president that permanent foreign alliances, however well-intentioned at the outset, tend to drag a nation into exactly this kind of expanding, multi-front entanglement driven less by direct national interest and more by the accumulated weight of obligations to partner after partner after partner. That's the honest picture as of this morning, not a simple story of Iran successfully closing off global oil trade single-handedly, and not a story of America simply defending clear-cut direct national interests either, but a genuinely tangled, still expanding web of alliances, proxies, and choke points, playing out almost exactly the way Washington warned it eventually would if the young republic ever abandoned the caution he tried to build into its foreign policy from the very beginning. So here's what I want to know from you this morning. Given how directly Iran's own Revolutionary Guard has now tied all of these export corridors together into a single declared doctrine, do you think the Bab el-Mandeb crisis gets contained through the same kind of diplomatic pressure that pulled Saudi Arabia into calling off last weekend's planned American strike? Or do you think this third choke point keeps escalating regardless of whatever happens in the direct U.S.?